We're going to look through at web services and specifically around some troubleshooting, installation issues, some security things, and we'll look at some performance recommendations and suggestions and talk through some of what can be quite confusing settings in IIS. So without further ado, the recording started. That's excellent. Great, in which case I shall share a screen and we'll crack on. Okay, so we shan't look at, we're not going to sit here and install FinPower Connect web services. We have a really good guide, installation guide, which runs through that process and should be easy to follow. We will obviously answer any questions you have if you have any issues, but hopefully what we're going to run through today will cover some of those off anyway. We will provide a link to the installation and configuration guide along with at least one blog post, which covers off some of the things we'll talk about today. We'll provide links to those in the video once that's uploaded to YouTube. So web services. To use our FinPower Connect web services, clients must be licensed for the web automation module. As you can see down here, web services and automation. They will also require separate licensing options for FinPower Connect Cloud and portals if they're looking to implement those as well. And both of those, FinPower Connect Cloud and portals, use web services and automation in the background. So there's no way of having one without the other. The web services themselves should always be running under on a SQL Server database. As you can see here, that will also require the Enterprise Edition to be added as a license option. The web services can be used with MS Access databases. However, we highly recommend that is only ever done as in testing, and ideally just as a proof of concept, proof of connection, that kind of thing, just to make sure they work. Using an Access database is basically untested, and in a web environment is almost, in a production web environment, is always going to cause issues. So I think we go out of our way to make it clear that SQL Server is what should be used. SQL Express is another option if clients aren't licensed for SQL Server and don't want to pay the additional cost of the enterprise module. Then SQL Express is definitely something we would recommend. The other thing to note with in terms of licensing, the third parties wishing to work with the web services, to consume the web services or develop using the web services, need to have signed a third-party developer license agreement before they can start work, or we can issue the web services files to them. So it's just something else to keep in mind. As I said already, when working in production, we want SQL Server. We would also insist that an SSL certificate be used on any production server, which will obviously provide them with an HTTPS secured site. Our web services should never be used in production running under HTTP. We do have additional security options in our web services for things like IP whitelisting, and those can be very, very useful to provide an extra layer of security. We log into our web administration portal, go to our configuration options here. You can see here we have our IP whitelist and the ability to allow unsecure HTTP access. And this, as I said, this should only ever be enabled for testing purposes and never be switched on in production. We have another option here to make web services unavailable. Obviously, if it's going to be scheduled down for scheduled maintenance or whatever, you can tick that on and it'll display a nice page which indicates as much. IP whitelist is very straightforward. You can give it a host name and an IP address, and it will accept only incoming connections from that IP address or IP range. Again, something to consider, particularly with if you're opening up a test environment, for instance, to the public. So if you've got a public-facing web server, you've got a test instance installed on there, you only want to allow access for certain IP addresses, maybe your local machines or someone else. I would highly recommend again that you make use of things like the IP whitelist. In regards to test and dev instances of web services, again, we would recommend that you host any test or dev instances in a dedicated test environment or a server that mirrors your live environment. Now, whilst FinPower Connect web services can be hosted locally on localhost on your own laptop, which is very useful for things like testing, in a real-world environment, when you're going to be testing things that are going to be put into a live environment, you need to make sure that you've mirrored that testing as closely as possible to live. The most common thing we see is that people will set up and make secure their production instance, and then they'll just have web services testing running on some other machine in the office. And of course, there are a number of other considerations to take into account when it comes to server configuration, IIS configuration, when it comes to a production web server, than there are when you're running it locally. So as I say, we would always recommend that wherever possible, you have a dedicated test or dev environment that you're able to test these things in, that mirrors as closely as possible your live environment. I'll open up IIS. Another thing to bear in mind with test and dev instances is, rather than having everything running under the same site, so you can see here, this is running locally on my laptop. So we're just running under the default IIS site. The other thing to consider with test or dev instances is to create a separate site to host those instances. That obviously goes some way to separating your production and test environments out. You can lock that particular site down, your test site down. You can even switch that test site off when it's not being used. And all of these things from a security point of view are things that people should be considering doing, rather than leaving particularly test instances open and running on in a live public-facing web environment. Also, test and dev instances as well shouldn't really be exposed outside of the local network unless there's a real need to do so. And as I said before, if there is, then you have the IP whitelisting to fall back on. We'll look at a couple of troubleshooting type of issues with the web services, things we commonly see. Windows features are for things like internet. The IIS Manager and ASP.NET are not enabled by default by Windows. So if you go and do a fresh install of Windows or a fresh install of Windows Server, then a lot of the Windows features that you'll need in order to set up IIS and configure IIS won't be there by default. Now, our installation guide details all of the Windows features that are required. Come in and check these off yourselves just by. I usually go into the search, turn Windows features on or off, and you'll see that it lists a whole stack of Windows features, just making sure that the necessary ones are enabled. So IIS, Internet Information Services, we have web management tools, and as you can see here, things like the IIS Management Console, which is what we're looking at here. All of these things are not necessarily enabled by default. So again, if you get people that are phoning up saying that they can't get the web services running, they've been through the guide 9 times out of 10, they've skipped through pages in the guide, and they may well not have enabled the correct Windows additional Windows features. Bear in mind, there's not only things for IIS, but also underneath our application development features, you have to have ASP and ASP.NET. Behind the scenes, the web services themselves are written in ASP.NET, so therefore, obviously, that's a dependency and a requirement for those to be installed. So just a bit of a gotcha, easily forgotten, and as I say, it's a nice quick fix. You can get people just to check on the relevant options. I'm not going to run through each one individually. As I say, they are detailed in our guide, One thing to bear in mind is that obviously at the moment we're looking at a version of Windows 11. In Windows Server, you can find these things rather than in Windows Features, they're under Server Roles. Again, that section is detailed in the document itself. The other thing to consider when it comes to troubleshooting installation issues, commonly another one we see is that the correct version of the .NET framework is not necessarily installed, depending on the version of Windows Server that's being installed, or Windows, I guess, being installed. Will depend upon the .NET framework itself and what version that's sitting at. The latest versions of FinPower Connect Web Services require .NET 4.8, .NET Framework 4.8. That must be installed on any server or PC wishing to run the web services. It will give you a runtime error in your browser window if that is not the case, and should be reasonably clear about what the problem is. But again, that's another pretty common one we get. Somebody setting up a server to run web services for the first time, sitting back on .NET Framework 4.6, 4.5, and unable to get things running. So it's just a straightforward case of downloading and updating that .NET framework. Other things we commonly see are permissions around folders. Again, once you've enabled IIS, you'll see in your folders, on your C drive, by default, IIS will create an inet pub, www root folder, and typically you'll just have your ASP.NET client and these two files sitting in there. As you can see, I've added additional instances of FinPower Connect Web Services and Cloud into there. By default, those folders won't exist until those Windows features that we spoke about a little earlier are enabled. Once they are, you'll see those folders appear. So again, it's a really good indication of those Windows features not being enabled, or the correct ones not being enabled. If you go into the C drive, either there's no inet pub folder or no www root folder. Permissions to these folders is the next key thing. The AppData folder is where our config file lives. And our config file is where all of our configuration options that we configure in our web admin form, all our database settings, etc., are held. They're all held in this AppData folder. We come back to Web Services 3. By default, that file won't exist as soon as you go into the Web Services admin and click on Change. That will create the file back into that folder, and it will fill it with all of the details that we've got set in your database settings here. The AppData folder requires permissions in order to be able to be accessed. By default, again, IIS users won't necessarily have the IIS users security group, won't necessarily have full admin rights to that folder. So it's a case of coming in to right click on the AppData folder, going to Properties and Security. Scrolling down, you should see an IIS users group. If you don't, then please add it. And that should then be set to have full control. That will enable that kind of config.xml file to be written to by the Web Services admin. If you're trying to update your admin settings and it's not working, then it's potentially you've got an issue. You'll have an issue with your folder settings, your security settings rather. So again, just bear in mind that's a really, really super common one. IIS users doesn't have the correct permissions to the web services files, can't write to them, and you get back an error in your browser when you try and access the admin. Okay. We'll talk briefly now about IIS and some performance options and things that we have over the years put together. By default, out of the box, IIS sets its own defaults, some of which are fine to leave. Others, depending on the site, may well require updating. We do again have some IIS configuration guidelines in the installation and configuration guide, but we did also publish a blog earlier this year with some performance recommendations around IIS. And just to note that the things we're going to talk about next are in no way a guarantee. Everything before once being applied to a server should always be tested. So again, this should not, nobody should be rushing out to a production environment and going ahead and willy-nilly changing all of these application pool settings. Really need to understand exactly what they do, why they're important, and where they may be of use to clients. And obviously, any changes made to any of this stuff should be done in a replicated test environment first. Last thing you want to do, rush off, make a whole bunch of performance enhancements that end up taking out some of production web services. Okay. The first thing we'll look at is what we're calling, what they call immediate application startup. So if we go back into IIS, by default, web services only start upon when the first request is received. So something we've commonly heard over the years is that the web services can be a little sluggish to initialize the first time a request is made to them, or after a period of time they seem to where they've not been used, inactivity. Then somebody makes a request. It can be sluggish to load back in the business layer pools in that first instance. And the reason for that is it's an IIS setting for application initialization. So first thing we do, we look at our application pools and we come into our FinPower Connect web services. You can see here, I've created a separate application pool for my web services in my cloud. Again, just while we're on the subject, please make sure that instances of web services have their own application pool, that you're not sharing an application pools with multiple applications. You can see here, I have my two instances of web services, version 3 and version 4, and same with cloud. I have those running under the same application pool. This is not obviously a typical production environment. We would really want to see those running in their own instances, along with any other applications that are being hosted on the web server. And that's really important because obviously if there's an issue with an application pool, then it means you're not taking out multiple applications. It's not taking out multiple applications at one time. Also, application pools are set to recycle, which means they basically dump everything and reinitialize every 29 hours by default, which is something we'll come back to look at in a moment in IIS. And if you've got everything running on the same application pool, then everything's going to be dumped out and reinitialized at the same time. So anyway, we'll look at our application pool. We can come into our advanced settings here. And you can see here there's a start mode. Now, by default, that's set to on demand. And what that basically says is that when there's been a period of inactivity, then the application pool is basically going to sit idle until it's requested. By having it always running means that that application pool is always available to service requests. Okay, so that's a really simple one and should be a nice quick win. Again, please test this stuff before it goes into a production environment. And if it's going into a production environment, it should be something that you're monitoring, obviously, as you go. So we need to set our application pool to always running. Once we've done that, we then have to make a modification to the application host file on the server itself. So on our server or on our instance of Windows, your System32 folder, there's an inet serve folder in there, and that will have a config folder, and within there is an application host file. That application host file, once you have the web services and things installed, will list all of the sites with it that are hosted within your instance of IIS. Once you've flicked on the always running on your application pool, you need to come in and enable preload on each of the instances of FinPower Connect web services or cloud or whatever it is you're looking to keep running. you need to add this tag onto the end. Again, this stuff is documented with screenshots and things in the guide. But just a note that as well as enabling that option on the application pool, also need to go and edit that application host file as well. Okay, as I indicated as well, the application pools themselves are set to recycle every 29 hours. This is an IIS default, so every time you create an application pool, it will set by default to recycle 29 hours time. This setting is controlled down here. You can see here 1740 minutes, which I'm reliably informed is 29 hours. This is not necessarily going to be of benefit for everybody. As I say, the application pool, when it's recycled, dumps everything out, recycles it. There is a performance hit. Things will stop working for a second or so and come back online. So it's a good idea to adjust that limit. I usually reset that minute to 0, which clears out minutes, and instead you can set that to a specific time. You can come in here and add a specific time that you want those application pools to recycle. A pretty good option, but assuming traffic to the web services is mostly happening during business hours, is to set that for the early hours of the morning. That just means that they'll consistently recycle at the same time, and it'll be outside of hours, so not to have such an effect on things. They can alternatively be set to recycle based on a virtual memory limit. Now, this is useful for sites that have, I guess the use case for this will be sites that have large web services memory footprints, so things like large global collections. So someone that might have, I don't know, a car motor finance company that has hundreds or thousands of external parties, all of which are going to get loaded every time the application pool is recycled. May well make more sense that if that virtual memory limit is being hit before the server gets trashes itself, you can set the application pool to recycle and dump out and basically garbage collect any memory that's been used. Again, don't switch this on by default. Do some testing, but it is a really useful option to have. And as I say, it is something that your virtual memory limit can be monitored under your worker processes. Under here, you can see listing the application pool name and how much memory that's actually consuming. Okay, so it's a good idea if you've got somebody complaining about issues of speed, you can come in and check and see how their application pools are performing. And that is potentially an option, is to say, okay, well, it's going to crash in the web server, or we're having real issues. Go and set the memory limit, an upper memory limit, so that as soon as IIS starts to use too much memory, it'll recycle the application pools and release everything back out. The last things to look at when it comes to in regards to our application pools and performance is something called rapid fail protection. We look at our advanced settings again. By default, you can see here that we have this rapid fail protection enabled. That's enabled by default by IIS, and what that essentially means is that if there is if something in an application pool fails to shut down cleanly, an application within the application pool fails to shut down cleanly within 90 seconds, then it considers it a fail. And if there are 5 maximum failures, then it stops the application pool. It just stops it. So this is this is one that we would recommend that everybody come in and disable. The web services and FinPower Connector applications currently seem to not always shut down cleanly. Now, that's currently under investigation as to why that is, but which can result in memory leaks. If any application all of a sudden doesn't shut down cleanly, if the application pool is being set to recycle really frequently, as in, a really short period of time, 5-10 minutes or whatever, then those 5 maximum failures could be hit. The application pool itself stops, and nothing is going to get through to your web services. So again, rapid fail protection. It's as simple as switching that to off. As I say, we would certainly recommend that is disabled in most instances. We have had a couple of instances of people that are recycling application pools very, very frequently for whatever reason, and they have fallen foul of that one. These are just some of the options that we have within IIS to improve performance. As I said before, can't stress enough, this stuff should all needs to be tested first, and probably needs to be tested in isolation of each other rather than going in and just making all of those changes all at once. But certainly something to consider, and things to look out for, particularly with some of your larger clients that perhaps have either higher traffic sites or, as I say, bigger things like bigger global collections, etc. That might be more of a take more of a strain on the application pools themselves. Hopefully there's some key takeaways from the session today. As I say, there is a pretty comprehensive installation and configuration guide. There's a troubleshooting section at the bottom. There's a stack more information in there than we'll have time to cover off today, as well as a really useful blog post which details some of those IIS and memory leaking issues in it as well. There will also be a follow-up to that blog post that's out probably after version 4. Okay, that's all I've got for you today.